My name is Ryan Jewell. I am a SATA and CW21 certified watchmaker working in New York City. Today we're going to break apart these two watches made by Carpenter watches. The one on the left, M15, has a Japanese movement in it. The one on the right, M2S, has a movement made in Switzerland. The Carpenter watches with the Swiss movement in it is $825, and the Japanese movement retails for $595. I am putting on what we call finger cots. The acids in your skin will actually permanently etch into the plating and finish. You always want to have a tool or something between you and the movement. To get started, obviously, you are going to want to remove the straps. To do that, you first want to use your spring bar tool. Spring bars are the two metal bars that attach the strap to the case. Next, we need to remove the case back. The case back's normally incredibly tight. I kind of loosened it just a tiny bit before we got started so I could open it with my fingers. I'm going to remove the oscillating weight, the moving half moon that will allow for automatic winding. The Swiss watch can operate as a manual wind watch or as an automatic watch. The automatic winding system is modular as opposed to integrated. Right now I'm removing the screws for the casing clamps for the movement ring. The movement ring sits inside the case and keeps the movement nice and centered. You typically will find these in watches where the movement is somewhat smaller than the diameter of the dial, so it kind of fills it out, keeps it centered, and secures it in there. Right now I'm removing the movement ring. And removing the stem and the crown. That's what you use to wind the watch if you're manually winding it. Since the stem goes into the movement, you have to pull that out before you remove the movement from the case. With the automatic winding watch, if you wear it every single day, you typically never need to wind it. But with the manual wind watch, it doesn't have that automatic winding mechanism, so you typically have to wind it. I normally recommend once a day. Setting the case aside, and the movement is now fully exposed, I'm going to put the crown and the stem back in to be able to move the hands in order to get them in a good position to remove them. Later on, if I need to hold the movement, I can hold it by the crown as well to kind of move it around. I typically like to put the hands at 12 o'clock to remove them. You use a piece of plastic to keep everything secure, and you do it very gently. With the lumi on certain hands, it can scratch the other hand, so you have to be very gentle. You can't just pry them up very fast. Otherwise, you could possibly scratch the hands or cause damage to the hub of the hands. Now that the hands are free from the posts, I'm removing them with a pair of brass tweezers and setting them gently in the parts tray. I use brass, and then the other pair is made out of nickel because they are both softer metals than steel, and so there's a chance that they'll do less damage to anything that you touch. Loosening the two dial foot screws, I was able to easily just pull the dial off from the movement, and now the movement is completely separate, and I can put it in the movement holder to start disassembly. The movement holder will keep the movement flat. There's little pivots and things that are sticking out that you don't want sitting down on the table, and if you try to work on them without something keeping it flat, then it would be very difficult and probably cause damage. With the Miyota 821A, the Japanese movement, you need to start on the calendar side, the dial side of the watch. With the Swiss movement, you want to start on the watchmaker side, the bridge side. Right now I'm removing the plate that's holding down the date ring. It kind of secures the date ring and a lot of the calendar functions down on the movement. Everything will be held down by a series of screws. Typically, you want to loosen all the screws and then go and grab them all. Reason for that being is it's faster and more efficient than setting down your tool every time you loosen one screw, picking up another tool, putting the screw away, then going back and forth. The thing that people really like about watchmaking is that it's kind of the incorporation of art and science. It is a craft, and there is creativity involved, but then there's also times where there are very strict guidelines that you have to follow. The date jumper spring basically keeps the date in a certain position, and when the date wheel comes around to move to the next date, it makes sure that it holds it in place to where it's centered in the window for the date. That is the date jumper spring. Now I will be removing the date disc, and this is simply the little disc that has all of the days of the month on it. It has teeth, so you can go from date to date, working with the jumper to keep it centered and in position. The hour wheel is the wheel that the hour hand is mounted directly onto, and so it has a rotational speed of 1 full rotation every 12 hours. I was working in non-for-profit arts, art house cinemas, film festivals, art museums, and I had about every cool job you could have in that field. And I love art, but I didn't like the day-to-day work. And so I decided I was going to quit, and I realized that every day when I went home, I wanted to do something with my hands, restoring antique furniture or taking things apart and seeing how it works and putting it back together. And so I looked into a few different things. Watchmaking ended up being the one that not only was the most interesting, but actually there's the greatest need. This is the intermediate date wheel. It's part of the train, which moves from the hour wheel to the date wheel. The jumper is what locks it into position 1, position 2, position 3. First position for winding, second position for the quick change of the date. Third position would be pulling the crown all the way out. That's for setting the time. The part is on a post. The movement's never been taken apart, and I've never worked on this movement before, so sometimes you kind of have to know the right way to go at a part to remove it. Otherwise, your tips of your tweezers, which are very small, will just kind of slip right off. Some parts are a little harder to get off than others. This is the setting levered spring. Here I'm removing the yoke. The yoke interacts with the sliding pinion, and it slides back and forth on the stem to either put it into a winding position or put it into time setting position. And this is a little plate that holds down the intermediate setting wheel and the minute wheel. It basically just keeps everything nice and secure and in place. This is the minute wheel. This engages with the cannon pinion, and it bridges the gap between the minute hand basically and the hour hand. This is the intermediate setting wheel. It basically just kind of transfers the power from the sliding pinion to the minute wheel and the cannon pinion. This is the cannon pinion, and this friction fits onto your center wheel. This is what you are actually pushing the minute hand onto, and so it rotates one time, and it engages with the minute wheel and the hour wheel that we had just removed. And here I'm removing the date wheel. Date wheel is what actually tells the calendar when to jump when it's at midnight. One key difference from the Japanese movement on the Swiss movement, this part is actually made out of plastic in the Japanese movement, which you will not find any plastic parts in the Swiss movement. This is the stripped down dial side of the main plate. We're going to have to flip it over now and disassemble the bridge side, or the watchmaker side, as it's also referred to. This is the side where the magic happens for the watchmaker. This is where we're doing the majority of our work. All the adjustments and stuff that we have to do in a typical service normally happen on this side of the movement. You'll find your power source here, the barrel and the mainspring, the gear train is here, the balance, the hairspring, all the parts that really make the watch tell time all happen on this side of the movement. The first thing that I'm going to be removing is the balance bridge with balance attached. It all comes out as one part, even though they're different components. That is what they call the beating heart of the watch. It's the balance with the hairspring, and that is attached to the balance bridge with a stud. So that's the thing that's spinning back and forth, the hairspring kind of expanding in and out, regulating your time. This is the one bridge on the Miyota movement. They call it the barrel bridge. That's what Miyota calls it. With a lot of other movements, including the Swiss movement, you'll actually have a series of bridges. You'll have a barrel bridge, you'll have a separate bridge that's covering the gear train, and then you'll have a module that sits on top of all of that for the automatic module for the Swiss movement. With this movement, the automatic components are actually underneath this bridge with everything else. So once you remove this bridge, nothing will work. I just want to give you a shot of the watch with the bridge removed, and this will show you the gear train, the barrel, the automatic components, all of it. Now I'm going to start removing the smaller individual components underneath, starting with the pallet fork. That is held down by the pallet fork bridge, so I'll remove that first and then remove the pallet fork, which is part of the escapement. The escapement is basically designed to allow the power to be released in very small measured incremental bursts. And this will impulse a jewel that's friction fit onto the bottom of the balance wheel and send it off into one direction. That mainspring, once it reaches its max, the spring will let it go. The spring will pull it back towards that pallet fork, and the pallet fork will impulse it the other way. And so it keeps getting pulled back into that pallet fork back and forth, and that's how the watch keeps running. This is the pallet fork, which is one of my favorite parts in a watch. It has two jewels that can be depthed by hundredths of millimeters, which can drastically change the way that a watch runs. It basically is kind of what makes everything work in a watch. It's what's impulsing, methodically letting out the power that you've been winding up in the barrel. It's kind of just where everything comes to a head. This is called the escape wheel, and it is the beginning of the escapement and the end of the gear train. This is called the fourth wheel. This is now when we're getting into the gear train. The gear train is going to be your series of wheels that transfers the power from the barrel and the mainspring to the escapement, as well as dividing the time. And here I'm removing the third wheel. This is an intermediate automatic wheel. Now I'm removing what I would call the reverser, and this is actually part of the automatic winding. This is part of the gearing that goes from the oscillating weight to the barrel to wind the watch with the motion of your wrist. And this is the barrel, or the barrel complete. It's actually comprised of 4 different parts, which would be the barrel drum, the barrel cap, the barrel arbor, and the mainspring. The barrel is the power source for the watch. And now I'm going to disassemble the barrel and show you the mainspring, which is basically pent up in there, kind of like a snake in a can. So you got to keep it all nice and closed or it'll explode out everywhere. You're winding up this mainspring inside the barrel around that arbor very tightly. Obviously, like any spring, it wants to expand, it wants to unwind, and that motion of wanting to expand is what causes the barrel to turn. That barrel turning is then sent into the gear train, which is transferring the power, dividing the time. Every time you service a watch, you normally want to open the barrel and replace the mainspring. You want to give them a new mainspring every time you service the watch. They come pre-coiled and you can just kind of insert them into the barrel and push them out of their little holder. This is the mainspring in a relaxed state inside the barrel drum. I'm just getting the tip of the mainspring out, and now I'm basically uncoiling it one coil at a time so it doesn't pop out and injure somebody. Once in watchmaking school, I wasn't so careful and it popped out and smacked me right in the eyeball, and it was not very comfortable. And that is the mainspring. That is what stores and distributes all of the power that you build up either by winding it by hand or with the motion of your wrist in the automatic mechanism. In all mechanical watches that you find today, they have what they call rubies or jewels. They're actually a synthetic corundum. A lot of people think that the jewels are precious, which is why the watch is expensive. The truth of the matter is they only exist for friction reduction. They're a 9 on the Mohs hardness scale. The only thing harder than that would be a diamond, which is a 10. And so they take a very, very high polish, and they are very strong. And so where you'll find jewels is anywhere that you'll find friction. And the goal is with the hard polished surface of the jewel and lubrication that's used in watches, the friction is reduced so much that you're getting the most amount of power through the gear train without losing any of that power due to friction. This is a bridge that's holding down a center wheel. Typically, the center wheel will rotate 1 time per hour, and the cannon pin will be affixed to the underside of it, and that's where you'll mount your minute hand. As the wheel rotates once per hour, your minute hand is rotating 1 time per hour as well. This is the seconds pinion. This is driven indirectly off of the gear train. If you bump your wrist or something, you'll actually see the second hand kind of stutter a little bit due to the slop in the gears and the indirect drive of the second hand. In the Swiss movement, it's a direct drive of the second hand, and so you don't get that kind of bumping. And now I've removed the center wheel. When you're disassembling movements, one thing that I always keep in the back of my mind is that in a lot of cases, a watch company will develop something and patent something. And so other watch companies have to figure out how to try to do the same thing by creating a totally new way of doing it. And a lot of times you'll find some very creative and frankly inefficient ways to do the same thing, but that's all they can do because the other more efficient way is patented. The basic design of how a watch works really hasn't changed a whole lot within the past 200 or 300 years. The main advancements that have been made have all been in the materials that are used. This is the click spring. Now I'm going to remove the crown and stem again, as the disassembly of this movement is almost complete. And that will allow us to basically strip it all down, put it all in the ultrasonic cleaner to clean the movement. This is your sliding pinion. Miyota, the Japanese movement, does it slightly differently than what I'm used to with a lot of Swiss movements. And so the sliding pinion and winding pinion kind of are smushed together in this one, as to where in a lot of other movements they're two separate parts. Now we've completely disassembled the Japanese movement, and all that we're left with is the main plate. This is a completely disassembled Miyota 821A. So now we're moving on to the Swiss movement. The Swiss movement actually does a lot of the same things in fewer parts. The watchmaker side of the movement with the automatic module still attached. I can remove that whole thing and you'll still have a functioning movement. And one of the big differences between the Japanese and the Swiss movement is that this movement has bidirectional automatic winding, which means either way that the oscillating weight moves, it will wind the watch. The Japanese movement only winds in one way. The other way, it just kind of spins freely without doing much of anything. Right now, I'm loosening the screws on the automatic bridge, which is its own separate bridge, unlike the Japanese movement. It's going to have an upper bridge, which you see on the top, and a lower bridge, which keeps all of the wheels of the automatic winding system in one place. It's all part of one module. I'm going to go ahead and set that down and disassemble the automatic module. Swiss has long been considered the preeminent watchmaking place, and it is a place where the majority of fine watchmaking happens in the world today. Funnily enough, actually, America used to carry that mantle back in the pocket watch days. When it came to standardized mass production, America made some of the finest movements that existed with companies like Hamilton, Waltham, Elgin. But those obviously all went out of business in the 1960s and 70s. But Switzerland has just got a long tradition of watchmaking. And so while Japan isn't necessarily known for their watchmaking, companies like Seiko, especially with their Grand Seiko line, have really been trying to kind of give the Swiss a run for their money. The way that the bidirectional winding works is, in this one, there are two reversers, and the other one there is only one reverser. The reverser allows, it's kind of a ratcheting system where if it turns one way, it allows it to slip. And if it turns the other way, it kind of forces that power down to the ratchet wheel, winding the watch. Since this one has two reversers, one of the wheels is always going to be locked and winding. The other wheel is going to be slipping. And depending on which way the oscillating weight turns, it changes which one is slipping and which one is locked. And here we fully disassembled the automatic module. So now we're going to disassemble the rest of the watchmaking side. As you can see, the automatic module has been removed, and we've got three different bridges. We've got our balance bridge, which holds the balance wheel with the hairspring attached to it. We've got the gear train bridge, under which the gear train obviously would be, and the barrel bridge. You'll find that watchmakers are not very creative in their naming of components. Now I'm removing the balance bridge, very similar to what you saw on the Japanese movement. The reason that little wheel is bouncing around so frenetically is because it's attached to the hairspring. Now I'm removing the pallet fork bridge and the pallet fork. The technical name for this type of escapement is called the Swiss lever escapement. This escapement was actually invented in the 1750s by an English clockmaker named Thomas Mudge. And while there are newer escapements that have been introduced, especially in the 1970s with George Daniels and the coaxial escapement and some other ones, this is the type of escapement that you will find in approximately 95% of the watches that are on the market today. Now I'm removing the gear train bridge. This just holds down the third wheel, fourth wheel, and escape wheel on the Swiss movement, as to where there was one bridge holding everything down on the Japanese movement. These are all the components that make up the gear train. There's only one wheel, I believe, on this movement that you need to remove the barrel bridge before you can get to it. But this secures all of the components of the gear train, which will transmit the power and divide the time. Watches and watchmaking were a very viable trade up until about the late 1960s, early 1970s. And at that point, what happened was watchmakers refer to as the quartz crisis. Quartz watches were introduced into the marketplace. They were exponentially cheaper, and they were 300 times more accurate than mechanical watches. So that's great and all for consumers, and everybody bought a quartz watch. But for watchmakers, it was terrible because you get paid to completely disassemble these intricate machines and reassemble them, clean them, adjust them, and it takes some time. But now all of a sudden you have this watch, and all you need is every year to 5 to pop open the case back, pop out the battery, pop in a new one, and you're done. Every once in a while, they'll use reversed threads. That ensures that as that wheel rotates, it's not going to unscrew your screw and send it flying out into your movement to cause all kinds of damage and havoc. If anything, it's going to tighten the screw even further. You had a lot of people that were getting out of the profession because they said they couldn't make a living anymore because of quartz watches. They said that watchmaking was a dying art. Of course, like everything is cyclical. About 20 years ago, mechanical watches started making a big comeback and really picked up steam within the last 15 to 20, which was great for all the watch companies, except for the fact that there's been 2 generations where nobody's been training to be a watchmaker. Now I'm removing the barrel bridge. This holds down the barrel with the mainspring inside, and I believe the second wheel, which is the great wheel. This is the barrel, and we're going to disassemble this one as well. There's really no difference between these two barrels. You'll have a barrel cap, a barrel drum, a mainspring inside that wraps around an arbor, which the arbor kind of comes out the top and the bottom, and that's what sits between the bridges and the turning points of the arbor. Rarely when you're sitting there disassembling a movement and making all these adjustments to very small pieces are you pondering the existence of time and how it relates to you. But more importantly, it's kind of a special thing to know that the work that you've done throughout the day is preserving pieces that people are going to pass down from father to son for generations, that are going to be collected and cherished, and that people will kind of wear as something that is a reflection of themselves. It's how they express themselves by the watches they choose. I've actually never worn an electronic watch. And that's really for the simple fact that I feel like I'm already kind of attached to my phone enough as it is. I don't really want to be any more available than I am with my cell phone. And so having a watch that just tells me what time it is and has kind of a link to history and the way things have always kind of run is something that appeals to me. This is the great wheel. If it were in the center, it would be called the center wheel, but it's not in the center, so it's called the great wheel. The Swiss has a hacking mechanism and the Japanese movement does not. When you pull out the crown, it's basically a very small L-shaped spring that will be pushed into the balance that will stop the balance from spinning back and forth, therefore stopping the time. This is the watchmaker side, or the bridge side, that has been completely stripped of parts. There's very little in the difference between the Japanese movement and the Swiss movement on the dial side of the watch. You're going to have a setting mechanism, you're going to have a setting lever and an hour wheel and a minute wheel, a date wheel that tells the calendar when to jump, a setting lever jumper. But the design on how those components work is going to be the big difference. This is the hour wheel. This is what the hour hand is mounted on. This is the intermediate date wheel, I believe. The Swiss movement, the setting mechanism is a lot less dependent upon these really tiny little annoying springs that I have no idea what they are. It seems like there's a lot of stuff going on in the Japanese movement as to where the Swiss movement is pretty simple. Of a mass-produced watch, the highest that they have is a 36,000 beat watch. That was made famous mostly by Seiko and Zenith with the El Primero, which was a 36,000 beat chronograph. There are some really boutique-y, like one-of-a-kind watches that run at really crazy speeds, 50, 60,000 vibrations per hour. With the difference between something small like even 28,800 to 21,600, or even the slower beat, which is 18,000, which you'll find with old pocket watches typically run at 18,000 vibrations per hour. You're not going to see a big change in price based on that alone. The date disc, the Japanese one is made of plastic, the other is brass. This is the date wheel, and as you can see, the Swiss movement is made of brass and has a spring-loaded finger. So literally the clicking over of the date might be a little bit more quick in the Swiss movement than you would in the Japanese movement. The rest of these components are very similar in the way that they work together and what they do. In addition to the vibrations per hour, there are some differences that you will not see even if you're looking at the gearing. One of those would be the power reserve. The power reserve means that if you wind the watch up to full wind, how long will it run before you have to wind it up again because it's run out of juice? On the Miyota movement, the Japanese movement, it has an advertised power reserve of 45 hours, which means that at full wind, it'll run for almost 2 days before it runs out of power. The Swiss movement, the ETA movement, has a power reserve of 40 hours. So not a huge difference, but a 5-hour difference between the two. While they say it's an advertised power reserve, that's normally kind of lowballing it. They like to underpromise and overdeliver in that regard. And so typically it'll run longer than that. They advertise basically kind of lower expectations. And this is normally determined by the length of the mainspring, the size of the barrel, and a lot of other factors will kind of determine how long a watch will run before it needs to be wound up again. This is the fully disassembled ETA movement, the 2824 from the Carpenter M2S. And finally, here are the two completely disassembled movements side by side.
Bring it on.
Station, this is Wired. How do you hear me?